January 18th, 1943. Guadalcanal, 0500 hours. The rifle lay across Lieutenant John George's knees like an accusation. A Winchester Model 70, 30-06. The bluing caught the pre-dawn light filtering through the jungle canopy, and somewhere in the humid darkness, another American soldier was dying. George could hear the wet cough of it, the abbreviated scream. The fourth man since midnight. His fingers traced the checkering on the walnut stock, smooth where his hands had worn it during 1,000 hunts in the Colorado high country. Deer, elk, nothing that shot back. Around him, the regiment slept, the exhausted sleep of men who had learned to ignore death. And George understood with perfect clarity that they were ignoring him too. The officer with the mail-order rifle, the champion marksman who had ordered a hunter's toy, shipped across 10,000 miles of ocean to a place where real soldiers carried real military weapons. He had heard the laughter, sharp, dismissive, the kind that cut deeper than any blade. George got himself a deer rifle, someone had said, when the crate arrived 6 weeks earlier. What's next? Gonna requisition a bird dog? Now the laughter had stopped, because men were dying, methodically, one shot each, always at dawn, always at dusk. Japanese snipers owned the jungle, and the Marine Corps had no answer. None of the 03 Springfields had touched them. None of the Garans had even located them. The enemy was killing Americans with the precision of a butcher selecting cattle, and the jungle swallowed every muzzle flash, every report, every trace. George watched his commanding officer approaching through the gloom. Major Carson moved like a man who had aged a decade in 6 months. His face carried the particular exhaustion of someone who had written too many letters to mothers. George. Not lieutenant, just the surname, the way you'd address a man you were about to use up. Your rifle. The Winchester. Can you really shoot it? The question hung in the wet air between them. Around them, the jungle breathed. Insects, birds, the rustle of things unseen. Death lived in that green darkness. Death with patience and discipline and the kind of skill that made American firepower irrelevant. Yes, sir. Better than you shot at the championships. George had won the Pacific Division Rifle Championship in 1941. 800 yards, 10 shots, 98 points out of a possible 100. But that was on a range, with flags showing wind direction, with spotters and known distances and time to think. Different kind of shooting, sir. I know, Carson's voice dropped. But we're losing men, Lieutenant. We're losing them to ghosts. If you can't stop them, we'll have to pull back from this entire sector, give up 3 weeks of gains, 3 weeks of dead Marines. The weight of it settled onto George's shoulders like a wet blanket. Not just the rifle, not just the mockery, but the accumulated cost of every step forward on this miserable island. The math was simple and terrible. Japanese snipers were killing 4 to 6 Americans per day. The division had lost 63 men in 2 weeks, not to banzai charges, not to artillery, to invisible marksmen who understood the jungle the way George understood the mountains back home. I'll need 4 days, George said, alone. Carson studied him. Behind the major's eyes, calculations ran. 4 days of one officer versus 4 days of losing half a squad. The arithmetic of war reduced to its ugliest form. You have 3. Hour 1. George moved into the jungle the way he had moved through Colorado timber. Slowly, reading the land, understanding the prey. Except here, the prey was human. Here, the prey was hunting back. The Winchester felt different in his hands now. Not lighter exactly, but more honest. This was what the rifle had been designed for. One shot, one purpose, absolute consequences. No second chances. No magazine to spray and pray. Just the shooter and the target and the narrow gap between life and death. He found the first position within 90 minutes. A banyan tree, 60 feet high, with a natural fork that gave a clear field of fire down a game trail Americans used for water runs. Spent cartridges lay in the roots below. 7.7 millimeter, Japanese. The sniper had killed at least 7 men from this spot, then moved on. George looked up at the position and understood immediately. The American way would be to cut the tree down, destroy the advantage. But that just pushed the problem somewhere else. The Japanese had dozens of these positions, maybe hundreds, and they were teaching Americans to fear their own jungle, their own territory, their own morning water runs. No. The answer wasn't to eliminate the positions. The answer was to eliminate the snipers. He settled into a thicket of ferns 200 yards away and waited. The jungle taught patience. After an hour, a gecko crossed his boot. After 2 hours, ants explored his rifle stock. After 3 hours, he had merged with the vegetation so completely that a wild pig passed within 15 feet without pausing. At hour 4, the enemy returned. The Japanese sniper materialized in the canopy like smoke resolving into substance. He wore no uniform George could identify, just mottled fabric that matched the bark, the leaves, the shadows. He moved with the kind of confidence that comes from weeks of successful killing. He carried his rifle, an Arisaka Type 38, with casual familiarity. He never saw George at all. The Winchester spoke once. The range was 217 yards. George had paced it mentally while waiting. The bullet took the sniper high in the chest, and he fell through the branches with the graceless finality of a puppet with cut strings. No drama, no last words. Just the physics of a 150-grain bullet traveling at 2,900 feet per second. One shot, one kill. George didn't move for another 2 hours. If there were more, they would come to investigate. But the jungle remained silent except for its normal chorus of life. And eventually, he extracted himself backwards, covering his trail, becoming invisible again. That night, he cleaned the rifle by candlelight in his tent. The mockery had stopped, but so had conversation. The other officers watched him with a kind of wary respect, mixed with something else. Recognition, perhaps, that George had crossed some invisible line, that he was hunting men the way he had once hunted animals, and the mathematics of it were starting to add up in America's favor. Day 2. The second sniper was smarter. He had chosen a position inside a massive strangler fig, using the natural hollow of the trunk as both concealment and protection. He fired through a gap no wider than a man's fist, and he had killed 11 Marines before George even located him. George found him by accident, or rather, by understanding. He had been studying the pattern of deaths, the angles, the times, all morning kills, all headshots, all men crossing a particular 50-yard span near the airstrip. That meant elevation. That meant patience. That meant someone who could wait through the heat and the insects and the cramping stillness for the perfect shot. The strangler fig stood 100 yards from the killing zone. Too obvious, George thought at first. Then he reconsidered. Maybe too obvious for Americans, with their preference for clear fields of fire and measurable distances. But for someone who thought like the forest, who understood concealment over convenience, it was perfect. He approached from downwind, if there was wind in this breathless heat, and positioned himself in a depression created by an old bomb crater. The range was 380 yards, long, but not impossible. The problem was the gap. He could see it now, that narrow firing slit. Hitting it would be like threading a needle while the needle moved. George waited. The sun climbed. Sweat ran into his eyes. His canteen was empty by noon, and he didn't dare move to refill it. The jungle pressed down with its wet heat, and somewhere in that suffocating green, the sniper waited too. At 1300 hours, a patrol moved through the killing zone. 8 men, walking with the kind of false confidence that came from daylight and numbers. George watched the gap in the tree. Nothing. The patrol passed unmolested. At 1400 hours, a single Marine, probably a runner with dispatches, jogged across the same ground. The gap in the tree flickered. Muzzle flash. The runner went down, clutching his neck, and the jungle swallowed the sound of the shot in its vast indifference. George fired. The Winchester's report cracked across the clearing, and he saw bark explode inside the hollow of the fig tree. He couldn't see the sniper, couldn't see if he had hit him or missed, but he cycled the bolt and fired again and again. 3 shots into that narrow gap, each one aimed at a slightly different angle, each one sending 150 grains of copper-jacketed lead into a space the size of a shoebox. Then silence. George remained motionless for another hour. If the sniper was wounded, he would either try to escape or die in place. If he was dead, his body would tell George everything he needed to know about Japanese training and tactics. If he had somehow survived, he would be waiting for George to show himself. At 1600 hours, George withdrew. He circled wide, approaching the fig tree from behind. It took him 90 minutes to cover 200 yards, moving with such care that he barely disturbed the leaf litter. When he finally peered into the hollow, he found the sniper wedged against the interior wall, his Arisaka across his lap, 2 of George's bullets in his chest, and an expression of surprise frozen on his face. 2 snipers, 5 shots. George knew he had been lucky with the second one, lucky to find him, lucky that 3 quick shots had found their mark in that impossible gap. But luck and skill were often twins in combat, and he was beginning to understand that his mountain training, the patience, the stalking, the absolute necessity of first-shot accuracy translated to this green hell better than any amount of military drilling. That night, Major Carson found him again. "The men are talking," Carson said. "They're saying you're some kind of ghost yourself." George looked at his rifle, at his hands. They weren't shaking. That bothered him more than the killing. The absence of reaction. The way his pulse had stayed steady while he had threaded bullets through a gap, the width of his palm, into another human being's chest. "I'm just a hunter, sir." "No," Carson's voice was quiet. "You're something else now. And so is that rifle." Day 3. The 3rd and 4th snipers worked as a team. George spotted them in the late afternoon, moving through the upper canopy with the synchronized grace of dancers. They had chosen positions 100 yards apart, creating a crossfire that would catch any patrol in an inescapable triangle of death. It was sophisticated tactics, professional, the kind of thing that required training and trust, and the recognition that 2 rifles were exponentially more dangerous than 1. George understood immediately that he couldn't take them sequentially. Kill one, and the other would vanish into the jungle like smoke. He needed to take them simultaneously, or near enough that the second wouldn't have time to react. The problem was geometry and physics, and the fundamental limitation of being one man with one rifle. He chose a position that split the difference, 250 yards from one sniper 290 from the other. Not ideal ranges, but workable. Then he did something that would have appalled his rifle instructors back at Camp Lejeune. He set up a decoy. His helmet, his pack, his poncho arranged around branches to suggest a human shape in the shadows. He positioned it in a location that both snipers could see, a place where an American officer might reasonably take cover while observing enemy positions. Then he retreated 50 yards and waited. The first sniper spotted the decoy within 30 minutes. George watched him shift position, saw the barrel of the Arisaka swing to bear. The range to the decoy was perhaps 70 yards. Easy shot. The sniper would be confident, eager even. An American officer was worth bragging rights, back in whatever hole they crawled into at night. The sniper settled into his firing position, took a breath, let it half out. George knew the rhythm, had lived it 1,000 times on target ranges and mountain meadows. That moment of perfect stillness before the trigger breaks. George shot him through the lungs. The Winchester's bullet arrived before the sound of the shot, and the Japanese sniper jerked once and went still. George cycled the bolt without thinking, muscle memory from 10,000 practice rounds, and swung the rifle to where the second sniper should be. Gone. The second man had vanished. Not into the trees. George would have seen movement. Not down. There had been no falling body, just gone, as if the jungle had absorbed him. George froze. His heart, which had remained steady through the first shot, began to hammer, because the second sniper was now hunting him. And the second sniper knew where George was, or at least where he had been when he had fired. The angles would give it away. The sound, the inevitable disturbance of vegetation. For the first time since he had entered the jungle, George felt what his targets must have felt, the suffocating certainty of being prey. He didn't move, couldn't move. Any motion would give him away. So he remained absolutely still, the Winchester ready, his eyes scanning the canopy, the undergrowth, the shadows, searching for any sign of the hunter who was now hunting him. 10 minutes passed. 20. The jungle's normal sounds had stopped. The birds, the insects, everything that lived in the Green Cathedral had gone silent in the presence of predators. It was just George and the unseen sniper and the space between them where death waited to flow in either direction. Then he saw it. Not the sniper himself, but the impossibility. A section of bark on a mahogany tree 30 yards away that was too uniform, too perfect. George stared at it, and slowly, the way optical illusions resolve when you stare long enough, he saw the outline of a human form. The sniper had pressed himself against the trunk, had become the tree, had merged so completely with his environment that George's eyes had slid past him a dozen times without registering the wrongness. The range was 93 yards. The target was perhaps 8 inches wide, the sliver of the sniper's torso that wasn't protected by the tree. George couldn't see the man's face, couldn't see his hands, couldn't see anything but that narrow strip of mottled fabric that might have been bark or might have been a human being waiting to kill him. He aimed for the center mass of that 8-inch strip and fired. The bullet struck bark and flesh simultaneously, and George heard the wet impact even at 90 yards. The sniper peeled away from the tree, stumbled 2 steps, and collapsed face first into the leaf litter. He didn't move again. George remained in position for another hour, shaking now, the adrenaline finally catching up with him. 3 snipers in one day, 7 shots. His hands trembled as he verified each kill, as he collected their rifles, as he noted their positions for the intelligence officers who would come later to study and document and reduce human beings to tactical lessons. That night, he couldn't eat. The mess tent's normal chaos of voices and metal trays felt obscene, unreal. He sat outside his tent and stared at the Winchester, and for the first time since he had been a boy of 12 shooting his first deer, he felt the full weight of what he had done. They weren't deer, they weren't elk, they were men who had trained and practiced and learned their craft with the same dedication he had brought to his. Men who had families waiting somewhere across the Pacific. Men who had chosen, or been chosen, to become instruments of death, just as he had. The difference was that George was better at it. That was the only difference. The only thing that separated him from the bodies cooling in the jungle was skill and circumstance, and the random chance that had made him American instead of Japanese. Major Carson found him there, staring at nothing. "You all right, Lieutenant?" George looked up. "I killed 3 men today, sir." "You saved maybe a dozen, maybe more. Does that math ever stop feeling obscene?" Carson sat down next to him. The Major was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the accumulated weariness of every commander who had ever sent men to die. "No," he said finally. "It doesn't, but we do it anyway, because the alternative is letting them kill us, and I prefer to write letters about dead enemies than dead Marines." "Those aren't the only options, sir." "No, they're not, but they're the options we have. Here, now, on this island." Carson stood. 4 more tomorrow. Intelligence says they brought in fresh snipers 2 days ago. They're setting up in the hills above Henderson Field. George felt something cold settle into his stomach. 4? 4 confirmed, maybe more. They're trying to shut down the airstrip. No airstrip, no supply runs, no supply runs. We lose the island. Carson looked down at him. "I know what I'm asking, George. I know what it costs. But I don't have anyone else who can do this." After Carson left, George field stripped the Winchester and cleaned it by candlelight. His hands moved through the familiar ritual. Bolt out, pour brush through the barrel, oil on the moving parts. The rifle had fired 7 rounds. 7 pieces of brass ejected into the jungle. 7 men who would never return to whatever home waited for them across the ocean. He thought about the championships, about the applause when he had won, about the way shooting paper targets had felt clean and simple and fundamentally harmless. He thought about the men in his regiment who had mocked the mail-order rifle and how they had stopped mocking after the first confirmed kill, about how respect and fear were sometimes indistinguishable. He thought about going home, about trying to explain to his father, who had taught him to shoot, what it meant to be this good at killing, about whether the Colorado high country would ever feel the same after he had learned to hunt men in the jungle. Then he pushed those thoughts away, because tomorrow there would be 4 more, and then 4 more after that. And the only thing keeping American boys alive was his ability to put a bullet exactly where it needed to go, exactly when it needed to arrive. He reassembled the rifle, loaded 5 fresh rounds into the magazine, set it beside his cot where he could reach it in darkness, and tried to sleep. Day 4. The last 8 snipers, George had been wrong about the number, had fortified a hillside overlooking Henderson Field like a medieval castle. They had built concealed positions at different elevations, creating overlapping fields of fire that would turn the approach into a killing gallery. Intelligence estimated they had been preparing the position for 2 weeks, hauling supplies, sighting ranges, coordinating timing. It was the most sophisticated defensive arrangement George had seen, and it had already cost 9 American lives in 2 days. Major Carson gave him one more day, one more chance. Then they would have to send in a platoon with flamethrowers and accept the casualties that came with frontal assault. George studied the hill from 1,000 yards out. 8 positions, maybe 10. Each one carefully camouflaged, each one covering the others. Any movement toward them would be spotted immediately. Any attempt to flank would require moving through open ground. It was a perfect defensive position, which meant there had to be a flaw. There was always a flaw. In the mountains, it would be wind direction. In the forest, it would be sunlight. Here, in the jungle, water. George saw it in his mind before he saw it on the ground. The hillside would have runoff during rains. The vegetation patterns showed it. Lusher growth in certain channels, sparser in others. And that meant gullies, natural approaches hidden from above. Paths that would bring him to the base of the hill without exposing him to the overlapping fields of fire. He moved at night, used the darkness and a half-moon to navigate by shadows and instinct. It took him 7 hours to cover 2 miles, moving through water when possible, staying below the sight lines, reading the land the way his father had taught him to read deer trails in the Rockies. By dawn, he was in position 300 yards below the lowest sniper nest, and he was chest-deep in a drainage ditch filled with water, the temperature of blood, with mosquitoes feeding on his neck, with leeches exploring his legs, with the Winchester held above his head to keep the action dry. He had never been so miserable in his life. He had never been so focused. The first sniper revealed himself at 0600 hours. A slight movement in the canopy, the morning light catching metal. George had been watching that position for 40 minutes, and now he understood its geometry. The range was 294 yards, uphill, through humid air. With his body submerged and his rifle resting on his pack to stay above water, he aimed high, compensating for the angle and the range and the fact that he was shooting from an unstable platform. Breathed out, fired. The sniper fell backwards out of his perch, and George cycled the bolt and shifted his aim before the body hit the ground. Because now the clock was running. Now the others knew he was there. Now they would be searching, coordinating, preparing to eliminate him before he could eliminate them. The second sniper appeared in a position 15 yards to the left of the first. George saw the muzzle flash as the man fired toward where George had been, not where he was. The bullet snapped overhead, and George put a round through the shooter's position. He didn't wait to see if he had hit, just cycled the bolt and shifted again. 3 and 4 came together, a coordinated attempt to bracket his position. George shot the left one first, then swung right and fired before he fully confirmed the target. Both men went down. 9 shots fired, 4 confirmed kills, 4 rounds left in the magazine. He reloaded underwater, his hands finding cartridges by feel, feeding them into the magazine by muscle memory, keeping his eyes on the hillside the entire time. The remaining snipers would be repositioning now, trying to get angles on him, trying to coordinate their response. But they were thinking tactically, thinking about fields of fire and cover and angles. George was thinking like a hunter, thinking about where prey went when it was wounded, where it ran when it was scared. There, a shadow moving down the hillside, not toward him, away, retreating to a better position, or escaping entirely. George tracked the movement, led it by 2 body lengths, and fired. The shadow stumbled and fell still. 10 shots, 5 kills. The 6th sniper made a mistake. Probably thought George couldn't possibly have spotted his position, 370 yards out, and partially concealed behind palm fronds, but he moved wrong. Just a slight shift that made the fronds sway in a way wind didn't. George aimed for the base of the movement and fired. 11 shots, 6 kills. The last 2 went to ground completely. George couldn't see them, couldn't hear them. They had become part of the jungle, and he understood with absolute clarity that he would have to wait them out, that they would have to make a mistake, or he would have to accept stalemate. Hours passed. The sun climbed. The water in the ditch grew warmer, then cooler, then warmer again. George's legs went numb. His shoulders screamed from holding the rifle ready. Leeches had attached themselves to his thighs, his groin, his stomach. He ignored them, ignored everything except the hillside and the 2 invisible snipers who were either waiting for him to show himself or slowly withdrawing to fight another day. At 1500 hours, he saw it. Not a sniper, not movement, but the absence of movement where there should have been movement. A section of undergrowth that the breeze stirred everywhere except in one specific spot, because something was blocking the wind, something human-sized. George aimed at that absence and fired. The 12th shot. A man stood up from the undergrowth, clutching his chest, staring down at himself in apparent surprise. He took 1 step, 2, then fell face forward down the hillside, rolling through the vegetation until his body wedged against a tree trunk. 11 Japanese snipers eliminated. 12 shots fired. George remained in the ditch for another hour, waiting for the last sniper to reveal himself. But there was no 13th target. Either the intelligence had been wrong about the numbers, or the last man had already fled, or George had somehow miscounted the dead. When he finally extracted himself from the water, he could barely stand. His legs had gone beyond numb to something like wooden uselessness. He had to use the rifle as a crutch to climb out of the ditch, and when he looked down at himself, he saw a dozen leeches attached to his torso, bloated with his blood. He removed them methodically, cigarette to each one, watching them release and drop, and then began the long walk back to camp. By the time he reached the perimeter, it was nearly dark, and he was staggering with exhaustion and dehydration, and the accumulated cost of 4 days alone, in the jungle, killing men who had never known his name. Major Carson met him at the camp entrance. Behind the major, soldiers lined the path, watching, silent. The kind of silence that contained equal parts respect and unease. "How many?" Carson asked. 11. "Shots?" 12. Carson looked at him for a long moment. "Jesus Christ, George." George leaned on the Winchester, the rifle that had been a joke, the mail-order weapon, the hunter's toy. He thought about telling Carson that it wasn't the rifle, that it had never been the rifle, that it was just a tool, and the real weapon was the patience and discipline and absolute focus that he had learned in the mountains long before he had ever heard of Guadalcanal or Japanese snipers or the mathematics of death. Instead, he said, "I need medical attention, sir, and a real meal, and maybe someone to tell me this mattered." It mattered. Carson's voice was quiet, but absolute. 9 men crossed that field today who would have died if you hadn't been up there. Tomorrow, maybe 30 more. Next week, 100. That's what it means, George. That's the math. George nodded, because what else could he do? The math was true, even if it was obscene. The killing was necessary, even if it was wrong. He had saved American lives by ending Japanese ones, and that would have to be enough. Had to be, because the alternative was admitting that skill could be wasted, that precision could be meaningless, that everything he had done in the jungle was just murder dressed up in military necessity. Epilogue. 3 months later, they found George in a field hospital on Bougainville. He had caught shrapnel from a mortar round, nothing fatal, but enough to punch a fist-sized hole in his thigh and send him spinning into shock. He remembered the explosion, remembered falling, remembered thinking with perfect clarity that after everything, after 11 confirmed sniper kills and God knew how many other targets, he was going to die from random artillery fire like any other grunt. Then he woke up on an operating table. The shock wasn't the pain. He had expected pain. The shock was the American doctor leaning over him, already cutting away his fatigues, already prepping the wound, already injecting morphine and barking orders to nurses who moved with the practiced efficiency of people who had saved 1,000 lives and intended to save 1,000 more. "You're going to be fine, son," the doctor said. "Clean wound. We'll have you patched up in 30 minutes. George stared at him, stared at the bright lights, the clean instruments, the nurses in actual uniforms, the absence of blood on the floor, the presence of soap and antiseptic, and the fundamental suggestion that his life had value. "No waiting," he heard himself say through the morphine haze. The doctor looked confused. "Waiting for what?" "For my turn, for—" George's voice trailed off, because he had been prepared for the Japanese system. For triage, that meant death for anyone who couldn't immediately return to combat. For the cold calculation that weighed one soldier's life against military necessity and usually found the soldier wanting. But this was America. And in America, apparently, even a lieutenant who had spent 4 days killing men in the jungle got immediate medical attention, got morphine, got surgery, got the kind of care that said your life matters, even here, even now, even in the middle of a war where death was cheap and men were expendable. "We don't have waiting lines here, son," the doctor said gently. "We have triage, but you're not critical. You're just hurt, and we fix hurt." He paused. "Besides, I heard what you did on Guadalcanal. Figure we owe you this much." George lay back and let the morphine take him. Let the nurses work. Let the doctor sew his thigh back together with tiny, precise stitches that would leave a scar, but would also let him walk again. Let himself feel, for the first time in months, the fundamental mercy of being treated like a human being instead of an asset or a target or a problem to be managed. Later, after the surgery, a nurse told him that the Winchester Model 70 had been recovered from the battlefield and was waiting for him in supply. That Major Carson had written him up for a Silver Star. That the regiment had stopped calling it a mail-order rifle and started calling it George's gun with the kind of reverence usually reserved for artillery pieces or tanks. But George didn't want the rifle back, didn't want the medal, didn't want the reverence. What he wanted was to go home, to return to Colorado, to climb into the high country and shoot at paper targets that didn't bleed or fall or stare in surprise at the holes in their chests, to remember what hunting had been before it became killing, to find out if his hands would ever stop shaking when he held his father's old Winchester in the mountains, where the only enemy was distance and wind. The nurse, reading something in his face, touched his shoulder gently. "You did good," she said. "You saved lives. That matters." George nodded. Because it was true. Because the math was right, even when it felt wrong. Because 11 Japanese snipers were gone, and dozens, maybe hundreds, of American soldiers were alive because of 12 precisely placed shots in the green hell of the Pacific jungle. But as he lay in the hospital bed, watching tropical rain streaked the windows, George understood something the marksman competitions had never taught him, that being the best at something didn't make it easier. That skill magnified responsibility rather than diminishing it. That the men he had killed would stay with him forever, not as enemies, but as mirrors. Other hunters, other marksmen, other men who had learned to make one shot count and had simply been on the wrong side of history's brutal mathematics. The Winchester Model 70 would ship home after the war, would sit in George's gun safe for 50 years, cleaned and oiled, but never fired again, would pass to his son, then his grandson, carrying with it a story that nobody quite believed and everybody repeated. 11 snipers, 12 shots, Guadalcanal, 1943. The numbers were true. The story was accurate. But what the story never captured, what no story could capture, was the cost of being that precise. The weight of being that good. The burden of knowing that your skill with a mail-order rifle had saved American lives by ending Japanese ones, and that both truths would have to coexist forever in the cramped space of your memory. George kept the rifle, but he never hunted again, because after you've learned to hunt men, deer just aren't the same. After you've put 12 shots exactly where they needed to go, the mountains feel different, quieter, lonelier, haunted by the ghosts of 11 marksmen who had been just as skilled, just as dedicated, just as human, and who had simply been slower on the trigger. The end.